In previous videos, I've talked a lot about different aiming misconceptions, and most of them tend to start and end with the idea of instant improvement. And the conclusion to all of those videos has been that there is no cheat code to aiming, and that it just comes down to putting in the time needed to develop your skills. But then, if you can't optimize outside factors, can you optimize the time you put in instead? Is there a most efficient way to train your aim, and if there is, what is it, and how far can we narrow this down? If you haven't already heard of them, aim trainers are that most efficient method. When compared to trying to train your aim by just playing the game, the amount of time you spend actually aiming is way higher in an aim trainer, meaning you get more practice in for your time, and on top of that, the ridiculous number of scenarios gives far more options when it comes to working on weaknesses in your aim when compared with any in-game training tool. Even if these scenarios aren't one-to-one with a specific game, aim trainers are still the best way to develop good technique, which will carry over into any FPS game. This probably isn't new info for you, but something I haven't heard answered as much is the how. How do we actually isolate and improve upon weaknesses? How can you tell what your weaknesses even are, and what's with all this vague discussion about good technique? My goal with this video is to go through everything you need to know to get into aim training and how to get the most out of it. I'm hoping to write this in a way that will naturally follow players' progression, and the info will build on what's said prior, but if you are more experienced and already know the basics, don't be afraid to skip ahead. For now though, let's start at the start. Which aim trainer should you choose? There are two main options I'd recommend to beginners, Aimlabs and Kovacs. Kovacs has better scenarios that cover a wider range of skills, and I strongly recommend it if the main game you play is Apex Legends for a reason I'll get into later, but Aimlabs is free. If you aren't sure you want to spend a lot of time aim training, I recommend starting with Aimlabs and seeing if you stick with it, and if you do, swap over to Kovacs. If you are going to put the time in, it's well worth the asking price. So you've got your aim trainer, what now? The first step is to get some nice settings. I've linked two videos below, both by Matty OW, where he talks about his Kovacs and Aimlab settings. How much these matter for improvement is debatable, but I personally find it a lot easier to commit to playing aim trainers with nice hit sounds and visuals. After that, I'd recommend trying the voltaic benchmarks. These aren't an all-in-one training tool, but they do provide some good scenarios to start with. However, more importantly, they give you an idea of where your skills stand relative to each other. This is the easiest way to identify weaknesses when you're starting out, and I think when you're below diamond on these benchmarks, it's worth trying to keep all of your skills at mostly the same level. So if you have any categories or scenarios that are significantly lower than everything else, try to bring those up to the rank of your best skills. This is because even though some skills are more applicable to some games than others at all levels, but especially when first starting out, the concentrated practice that any of these scenarios provide will benefit you in game, even if right now it might not be obvious how these things link together. If you're on Aimlab, you can find the benchmarks on the Voltaic website. Click Assess Your Aim and try out the scenarios, and it'll automatically fill out your scores for you as you play. This is going to be done with Kovacs benchmarks at some point in the future, but for now you can find them on this spreadsheet. You fill your scores in here as you play each task, or you can use the Auto Updater tool, which does this for you, and all three of these are linked in the description. I would recommend only playing the benchmarks maybe 2 times a week at most. They are good for testing yourself, and especially when you're first getting into aim training, they will help you improve, but I still think most of your time should be spent practicing. This practice comes in multiple forms. How I approach this personally is something I'll cover in a bit, but as a baseline when starting out, if you want to aim train every day, I would recommend spending 3 days playing playlists that target weak areas in your benchmarks, 2 days playing either the fundamental or game-specific routines for your game of choice, and the other 2 days benchmarking, but this is just a guideline. I've also linked a bunch of both game-specific and weakness-focused routines by myself and others in the description as starting points, but these are just guidelines as well. As your main weaknesses or main games change, you should change routines to match, but you can customize them further. If you think a routine is too long for how much time you have or too hard for your current skill level, don't be afraid to remove scenarios or change scenarios out for easier versions. It's totally okay to change these things to suit your preference or time restrictions. There is a more important discussion to be had when it comes to time management and aim training though, which is how you should balance your time spent in the game versus aim training. This varies so much, it's hard for me to even give a rough estimate, but it depends on your experience and game of choice. the less experienced you are on mouse and keyboard, the bigger the benefits of aim training will be, since an hour of aim training for a person who started playing on PC yesterday is a much larger percent of their total playtime than an hour of aim training would be for me. Because of that, it's easier to justify playing more aim training relative to others when you're brand new. The other big factor is which game you play. Valorant and most other tactical shooters forces its players to get very good at one specific skill, micro adjustments. There are exceptions, but you can win a lot of gunfights in that game by just being able to make small movements accurately. Compare this to Apex or other high time to kill games, where its wider weapon variety and higher time to kill force more consistent and varied aim over a longer period, placing a higher demand on raw mechanical skill. This means that the benefits of aim training will shine through more in Apex, especially scenarios like Control Sphere, Whiz Sphere, and Air, which not only feel very analogous to tracking in that game, but they also develop very important fundamental skills and basically force good technique, which will help you in game. This is also why I recommend Kovac so strongly for Apex players, by the way. AimLab doesn't do scenarios like this nearly as well. These tracking tasks will help in Valorant as well, but only for the fundamentals and skills they build. The movements don't directly translate, put a pin in that, I'll come back to this later. So those are the two main factors, skill level and game of choice. Personally though, I'd put an upper limit of spending 20% of your daily FPS playtime in an aim trainer. Past this, you're typically getting into the territory of diminishing returns, and that time is better spent playing the game. A little bit ago, I mentioned technique, and this is a topic with so much depth I can't cover it all in this video, but I think it can be underpinned with a single idea, which is making your mouse movements more efficient. This on its own is somewhat meaningless, but it should become a bit more valuable after going through some of the aiming categories and seeing how it applies within them. Static clicking is, on its surface, the simplest category, and when I first saw a scenario like this, I thought, how could this possibly be useful? It's just dots on a wall, and yet it's invaluable for developing and refining proper flick technique. When you're playing scenarios like this, try to make a fast initial flick which lands close to the target before making a smaller movement to correct for any errors made during your first. The simplicity of this scenario type is its strength. These two core movements, the flick and micro correction, appear everywhere in more advanced forms, but by stripping away all of that fluff, you can isolate the underlying motions. To link it back to that key idea, there are two main ways you should try to optimize your mouse movements. For both initial flicks and micro adjustments, you want to try and draw as straight of a line as possible between your starting point and the target. Curving or having jagged lines is a pretty common issue and something to try and smooth out sooner rather than later, even if it comes at the cost of initial flick speed. The second thing to focus on is where your flick lands. Obviously, dead on is ideal, but this isn't always possible, and underflicking is far preferable to overflicking. This is because of the change in the direction of the force you're applying when you overflick and have to correct backwards. It's a lot harder than just following through with the same motion. This concept is even more applicable to tracking, it just applies in different ways. One of the most common issues I see in tracking is over-adjusting after the target changes directions. Both overshooting and landing on the far side of the target are suboptimal here, since even if you don't miss initially, you're still moving the mouse more than you have to. This increases the amount of distance the target travels relative to your crosshair, making their movements harder to read. This often leads into chaining these over-adjustments together, which leads to this feeling of always lagging behind what the target's actually doing. The easiest way to avoid this is try to land on the middle or inner edge of the target. By minimizing your mouse movement, you make it easier to read the targets, and when it changes directions again, you'll remain on it for longer before having to readjust. Dynamic clicking almost blends both of these because it requires clean flicks to first reach the target, clean micro adjustments when needed, and good movement reading skills to tell where the target is going to end up. Having straight lines and not overshooting helps with movement reading as well, combining the skills needed in the two previous categories, and again, minimizing mouse movement is what is needed to have good technique in all three. That's most of the key information needed to get started and get a lot of value out of aim training, but what if this isn't working for you? Maybe you've reached a plateau and you're looking for a new way to practice. And I think this will happen to everyone at some point. Routines are good, but can only get you so far, and in my opinion, past a certain rank you need to look into more self-directed training. What I do personally when training for a specific FPS game is I'll play aim trainers for maybe 15 minutes as a warm-up beforehand, and after my play session, I'll aim train again for another 30 to 45 minutes, but during that time, I'll focus more specifically on issues I noticed while playing. As an example, if I'm playing the finals and I notice that I'm somewhat shaky when trying to track with my arm, after my play session, I'd play some smoothbot to try and address that issue instead of doing any weakness-specific routines. The caveat with this is that you have to be able to pick out your issues very quickly. VOD reviewing might be helpful if you can't do it in real time, but this is something I'd only recommend trying if you have hit that plateau and you want to try and change up your approach. But what is the benefit of choosing my own scenarios instead of choosing a routine containing scenarios that are meant to do the same thing? The answer to this is threefold. A minor reason is that I personally find I improve faster if I change up what I'm doing consistently. Picking out scenarios to play by hand lets me do that far better than swapping between different routines. The next is that routines can sometimes lead to autopiloting when you just hop on, play your routine, and hop off. This is fine and will still help, but I think forcing myself to be more mindful about what I'm playing and why I'm playing it helps give myself direction and prevents aim training from just becoming a habit. It's focused practice instead. Which leads well into the third point. Picking scenarios specifically gives me far more control over the level of focus I want to place on a certain skill. Even the best routines, unless they are made for you, can't target all of your weak points all of the time, but by doing this, I can make good on that initial pitch for aim training and isolate issues as specifically as possible to improve on them faster. The two hardest parts of this more self-directed approach is figuring out what your weaknesses are at a more specific level and finding the right scenarios to address them, so let's tackle those in order. When VOD reviewing your aim trainer gameplay, try to find a top run of that scenario and compare and contrast your run with theirs. To be specific, look at the differences in your approach and what skills they're leaning into to play it the way they do. I think this is best explained with an example, so I'm going to compare my static runs with a previous top static player with a similar style to my own. Trust the mix. When watching these two, you can see that we have a similar initial accuracy for smaller flicks, and I might even be better at these, but over wider angles, he both lands closer to the dot and corrects to it quicker. This is because most of the time when he does miss the initial flick, he stops before reaching the target, and all he needs to do is make a small correction in the same direction. Compare this to my run, I have more directional inaccuracy. My lines curve over wide distances, so I have to correct sideways, which takes longer. So I don't need to work on my closer flicks for now and should instead focus on cleaning up my lines on my wider ones. Even though Trusty and myself are fairly close in scores, this method still works with a wider skill gap between you and the person you're comparing to as well. Even if you can't isolate a specific thing that you're worse at, you can identify how they're approaching the scenario and figure out where you differ. For another example, my girlfriend JD has gotten into aim training recently and she watched Matty's VODs to learn from, even though she was several ranks lower. On Bounce 180 specifically, she noticed that he would mainly focus on targets towards the center of the map and often kill them right after they spawn, whereas she would focus on all targets equally and because of that lost a lot of score going for ones near the corners. By addressing this core issue in her approach, she was then able to focus on improving specific things like leading shots and building up speed over time instead of being stuck because of an incorrect technique. But how can you know what scenarios to play to actually do any of that? There is a list of recommended scenarios for Kovacs and AimLabs by Voltaic, which has heaps of things to try out sorted by category, which should help narrow them down to what you're looking for. But if you want to be more specific, try to play variants of scenarios you know of by searching for the keyword of the scenario name or a part of the scenario's name. So for my example of trying to improve my static, if I type in 1W, one of the scenarios that comes up is 1W2TS, and by removing two of the dots, it forces me to isolate the larger flick specifically. Then if I search for that, 1W2TS Pokeball appears, which is a variant where I don't have to click, and I can just hold down mouse 1 for the entire scenario, letting me be even more specific with my practice. And then I can type in Pokeball and try all of these and so on. By trying different variants and taking note when a scenario is really good at targeting a certain issue, either mentally or by writing them down, you can build up a list of scenarios to refer to when you do identify an issue to work on. But of course, the hardest part of all of this is figuring out what a scenario actually trains. This is challenging for so many reasons and varies based on your approach, but I think that tearing down the core categorization the benchmarks used is a good start. And I know I've used this structure all throughout the video. It does have its uses, but when looking at aim at a deeper level, I think it's counterproductive to keep this limited framework. I'm sure you've heard something like static and dynamic for Valorant, smoothness is good for Apex, and reactive for Overwatch, and all of this is true, but I think it overlooks how interconnected aiming actually is as a skill. Like I broke down earlier, static isn't training you to hit stationary targets, it's isolating and refining your ability to make accurate initial flicks and micro-adjust afterwards. This level of deconstruction can be done to every category. They each develop core skills that will be applicable to other categories and games even if they don't explicitly contain that skill. So then, what is tracking training? Well, your tracking, but also your micro adjustments. When you break down a scenario like Control Sphere, it consists of a micro adjustment and a follow through, and when you look at it like this, its application in Valorant becomes a bit more clear. It's training those core movements, and even though they won't be as exaggerated in-game, that control still translates. How about air then? Air trains a lot of things based on which bot you're on, but I'd like to zoom into this one. These long strafes are working on your ability to track other long strafes, but also developing the skill of going from a wrist micro adjustment into tracking with your arm while maintaining good smoothness. And then those arm movements are working on your stability, giving you a finer control over the speed your arm is moving at, which then, weirdly enough, will help your static dots. By developing that control with your arm, slowing down at the end of a flick becomes easier, your movements get less jagged, and transitioning into a micro adjustment is more fluid because you've already trained blending different muscle groups together. This series of links is kind of like a big ball of string. You find the right string to pull and it all comes loose. This is why working on weaknesses is so crucial as well. Even though it might not be obvious, a weak area might not just be an isolated weakness. It could be holding you back in other areas. This is a topic that extends so far outwards I can't even start to cover it all here, but I hope these two examples are enough to get you thinking about scenarios, the skills they train, and how to work on weaknesses in a new and more in-depth way. And I think that's everything I want to cover in reference to the topic, but I just want to say a massive thank you to making it to the end of this and for all the support on my recent videos. It's a little surreal, to be honest. I wasn't expecting to get to 20k in like months, and it looks like it's not going to be long before we get to 30k now. This has all gotten me to take YouTube and content creation a bit more seriously, and I want to try to do this as a job if I can, so as weird as it sounds to announce, I have a Patreon now. The benefits for each tier up on the screen, and I've tried my best to offer some nice rewards, but please don't donate if you don't have the money to. This is just if you've got some extra money and want to support what I do. I appreciate you all wanting to watch what I make either way, and thanks again.